Today at the National Press Club, astronomer and former Vice-Chancellor at the Australian National University, Brian Schmidt, and economist Richard Holden. They'll discuss how Australia can secure its sovereign research capability. Professors Brian Schmidt and Richard Holden with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. My name is Julie Hare, I'm a director here at the club and the education editor at the Australian Financial Review. Today's address is securing Australia's sovereign research capability, and I think pretty well everyone in this room can agree there's far too little attention paid to research, sovereignty and our capability in the modern world. Our guests today are Brian Schmidt and Richard Holden. I will give you a brief introduction for each of them. Professor Brian Schmidt needs little introduction, but let's give it a go. He's a distinguished professor of astronomy at Australian National University, a Nobel laureate in physics, and a former Vice-Chancellor of Australian National University. Obviously, the CV is very long and very impressive. So instead of listing his many other numerous awards, achievements, and explanations for the letters behind his name, I thought these lines from the ANU student paper Waroni, from an interview he did just before his departure at the end of 2023, might give a more idiosyncratic and perhaps accurate insight. Quote, "The tranquility is pierced, but not broken, by ANU's departing Vice-Chancellor and Nobel laureate Brian Schmidt. He is not loud, but he is passionate, and he has a lot to say on a lot of things. But notably, he is an arm waver. As he speaks, every concept is given a corresponding gesture." We'll see whether he can keep that up today. Now then, to his right is Richard Holden, Professor of Economics at the University of New South Wales Business School and the President of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. His research focuses on contract theory, organisational economics, law and economics and political economy. He is a regular commentator in the media about all manner of things, including the economics of Trump's America, the economics of Albanese's Australia, and why Jim Chalmers is wrong. Richard, from my experience, is not an arm waver, but like Brian, he is not loud, but passionate. For those of you watching at home, you can join the conversation on Twitter, where our handle is @PressClubAust, or you can use the hashtag NPC. Our first speaker will be Professor Brian Schmidt. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, everyone. So I'm here on the National Press Club on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I would like to acknowledge these traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people who are with us or watching today. Now let me take you back to February 1940, to the University of Birmingham. World War II had just broken out, and 38-year-old Mark Oliphant, an Australian-born physicist who went on later in life to found the ANU Physics Department and the Australian Academy of Sciences, had just had his lab invent the modern microwave resonant cavity that could create incredibly intense radio waves in a device of a size such that you could fit it in your hand. That was a discovery that revolutionized radar, allowing it to be ubiquitous, giving it great precision, and even enabling it to be put on airplanes. Oliphant took that invention to the US for mass production, and it has been argued by some that more than any other single thing, this physicist's invention altered the course of the war towards the Allies' favor, profoundly diminishing the effectiveness of the German Luftwaffe. But that's not the only thing that happened in February. Two Jewish physicists who had fled Nazi-controlled Europe, Otto Frisch and Rudolf Peierls, had taken up positions in Oliphant's lab and were tasked by Oliphant to work on nuclear fission, ironically because the radar work was too top secret for German nationals to work on. While he focused on radar, Oliphant asked them to calculate how much of the newly discovered element uranium-235 would be required to create a nuclear chain reaction. The answer came back in a few weeks, and the answer was startling, about 5 kilograms. And that has altered the course of humanity. They had demonstrated that a nuclear bomb was possible. And given the advanced state of physics in Germany at the time, it seemed inevitable that the Germans would create one. Oliphant ventured, as with radar, back to the United States, this time with the nuclear secret, and thus was born the Manhattan Project. Germany arguably had the most advanced physics research capability in the world in the 1920s and early 1930s. But by 1940, they didn't. The Nazis had driven away all of their Jewish scientists, which were a large fraction of the German scientific endeavor, and treated the scientists who remained largely with contempt as dangerous intellectuals. The refugee scientists took up residency largely in the UK and the US, creating a technical ascendancy for the Allies, breaking, whether it be on code breaking, radar, bomb sites, penicillin, or nuclear weapons. It was a major part of the ultimate defeat of the Nazi regime. Now, in 2025, we are seeing how quickly the nature of conflict is evolving within the Russian-Ukraine war. And we can expect new technologies based around small-scale automated machines, hypersonic missiles, computer warfare to feature prominently if we are ever to have future conflicts between advanced economies. In such a case, the research capability of a country will be incredibly important at influencing the overall winners and losers, because once the conflict starts, you kind of have what you've got. You do not suddenly create the research and researchers. That takes decades. Now, I hope we never get to this state, but nor should we stick our head in the sand and ignore the possibility. The much better part of research, however, is the prosperity it brings through new products and ideas that make lives better. But understanding the research ecosystems remains elusive by much of the public, politicians, and even policymakers. One of the most common conversations I have with people, especially politicians, goes something like this. Hey, Professor Schmidt, the astronomy you do is really cool, but why does the government pay you to do it? It's a question that ruffles many of my colleagues' feathers. The universe is beautiful. Understanding it has deep cultural significance. It fills the world's heart with wonder. And indeed, those are reasons I chose to study astronomy when I was 18. But these are not really the reasons why government funds my research. The government funds the study of the universe ultimately because the knowledge we create and the people we train create immense value for Australia and for the world. Just look at your phone. I've got mine. My areas of astroparticle physics provided breakthroughs necessary to enable the World Wide Web and touchscreen, both done at CERN, the Wi-Fi, done right here in Australia by radio astronomers, the GPS using precision time clocks in space along with general relativity, and the ubiquitous camera. CMOS technology there was developed for the Galileo mission to Jupiter. Our graduates, well, many work in academia. Even more work in high-tech companies in defense and government and finance. And as Richard will soon talk about, their ideas boost productivity. But as a minister once asked me, yeah, but Brian, why do we have to do the astronomy? Can't we just go straight to the good stuff? Sounds perfectly sensible, but it doesn't seem to work in practice. The exciting part of innovation is not incremental, it's revolutionary. And yes, we need entrepreneurs to take new ideas and work on the good stuff, but we also need to have a sea of ideas that is continuously replenished from which the innovators can kind of fish for the next big thing. As Richard will explain, this public good basic research is a classic market failure and is a place where governments need to intervene. Let me tell you how it works for me personally. I immigrated to Australia in 1994 because Australia had invested for 50 years in astronomy, and I knew I could competitively do my project to measure the fate of the universe based here in Australia at the ANU. It was an environment every bit as good as what I had had at Harvard. That basic research program, in addition to winning me the Nobel Prize, put me in close connection to world-leading instrument groups, to national and world leaders, to tech giants, and to financiers. It positioned me to lead the National University for 8 years, where we radically overhauled our technology transfer program to emphasize getting our ideas out of the university so Australian society could benefit, and not spend our time killing ideas through a fixation of ensuring future royalty streams would come to the university. This change increased the deal flow out of the university by an order of magnitude, including 2 companies that are based on the efforts that went into another Nobel Prize-winning detection, that of gravitational waves from emerging black holes. And I played a small role in the science there too. Now, one of those companies is Liquid Instruments, whose founder, Daniel Shattuck, is in the back of the room here today, which is revolutionizing measurement and test equipment by replacing the usual intricate array of custom hardware components with software and high-speed computation. It's now manufacturing its products here in Australia with millions of dollars of sales globally, and is, in my opinion, on path to become a major global tech firm. When I was asked by the Liquid Instruments board recently to join them, I knew I had the experience that could help them hopefully become an iconic global tech firm, but I also felt I had a responsibility to Australia to help make it happen. So when astronomers asked the nation to continue to support our world-leading research through investment in the next generation of facilities, and yes, we do know it's expensive, remember that we provide great value to the nation through a range of spillovers that include some of the most significant Australian innovations, but a range of less direct things with respect to skills, to capability, to relationships, and to public engagement. Those all come from our global excellence. Our past has demonstrated that public investment was actually useful, and we have plans to do even more into the future. A challenge we have, though, is that the dividends of such research are paid in decades, not in the timescale of elections. The public and politicians they elect are impatient and are prone to create a new set of programs that seem okay, but fail to create a long-term ecosystem from basic research all the way to R&D intensive companies that Australia needs to boost our productivity. So rather than just admire the problem, let me outline quickly what I think success might look like. The first thing is continuity. Research works on decade-long horizons, and when we improve our sovereign research system, we need to think on those timeframes, not in terms of one-off programs. In the 13 and a half years since I was awarded the Nobel Prize, I've had the privilege to work with 16 different science ministers. The longest serving one of those, Ed Husick, is here today, and I want to thank you for your efforts. And I know you will continue to help Parliament shape the innovation ecosystem into the future. To his successor, Tim Ayres, I look forward to working with Tim, and a genuine ask to Tim is to serve as minister for at least as long as Ed did. We will not improve our system without continuity. Secondly, we need to positively engage in creating a comprehensive program across the ecosystem, not a series of one-off policy announcements that last 12 months and leave gaping holes. I say positively for a reason. For the past 2 years, as a nation, we have spent a great deal of time talking about what we do not like about our universities. I, at least, have heard the message loud and clear. But it is also time to focus on what we want out of these institutions as a nation, especially with respect to our sovereign research capability. This extends to agencies like CSIRO, ANSTO, and DSTG as well. Right now, Australia's policy environment does not obviously support our aspirations. For example, AUKUS is not just about nuclear subs. It is also meant to be a comprehensive technology partnership to create advanced capabilities in a range of disciplines that concentrate around the physical sciences and engineering. Similarly, our critical mineral strategy requires a range of expertise cutting across geology, geochemistry, and engineering. As someone who recently finished leading a university that worked in all of these disciplines, let me tell you that the current policy environment is forcing universities to divest and do less in these areas, not more. Infrastructure and equipment, materials, and buildings of these subjects are the most expensive of any research area and are not paid for by the Commonwealth. The Jobs Ready graduate program reduced substantially the resources universities get per students in these areas. If you want a program that creates world-class graduates in these areas of national interest, it's going to run at a loss. And Richard will talk more about this too. Finally, we need to spend a lot more time and effort creating R&D intensive companies. This could be new companies like Liquid Instruments, or it could be getting the right local companies to be prepared to use R&D to grow through innovation. And this usually means thinking globally rather than concentrating on our domestic market. Understanding the market failure that is occurring in our innovation ecosystem is a major piece of work, worthy of our best minds, and a long-term comprehensive response is definitely warranted. I do not have a complete set of answers, but I do note that some recent policy interventions have been good, like the recent PhD internship program, which encourages PhD students to spend time with Australian companies. It's good for the students, it's low friction, brings researchers and companies together more effectively than anything else I have seen, and it's pretty cheap. Something that is not cheap is the continually evolving R&D tax concession, which has not proven to be a panacea, which one might hope, given it costs taxpayers each year more than the research funding contained in the ARC, the NHMRC, CSIRO, DSTG, and the Medical Research Future Fund combined. It's not that I don't think such expenditure might not be warranted, but one should expect results from this level of investment that are not obviously present. Now, members of the business community here are going to be rolling their eyes saying, not another change to the R&D tax concession. And so I acknowledge that I was talking earlier about the importance of continuity. But I'm also reminded of the apocryphal quote, and no, Einstein did not say this, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. We need to take a big look at the ecosystem, like Robin Batterham did in 2001 with the 5-year Backing Australia's Ability program. Now, that didn't get everything right. It's where the R&D tax concession came from. But it's thought through the ecosystem and made a comprehensive set of policies. What we have failed to do since, in my opinion, is a holistic 5-yearly refresh of that program, where we learn what has worked and discard what hasn't. It really has been a year-to-year series of wallpaper jobs for the last 20-odd years. Now, I hope I've reminded you that our sovereign research capability has enormous consequences for Australia's future. I would hope that we would never forget this, but I look around and I'm actually scared. The Australian government investment in its sovereign research capability was a third higher 15 years ago as a fraction of GDP. And in the United States, our largest research partner, the university sector is under siege on multiple fronts, including the Trump administration proposing to immediately have expenditure in the National Science Foundation and the NIH, which are the bedrocks of US research. Let me remind you what China's up to. They raised their R&D spend last year by 8.3%, having increased their R&D spend as a function of GDP by more than a factor of 5 in the time I have lived in Australia. During that time, Chinese GDP has grown in real dollars by more than a factor of 20. The two figures are not actually unrelated, but that together is a 100-fold increase, of which many of the benefits of that research to the Chinese nation have yet to accrue. And so as I finish and hand over to Richard, I want you to think what their increase and our decrease means for Australia's future economic and security environment. I find it a very much a sobering thought. Thank you.
I too acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people with us today. Brian has just given us a rich and vivid description of the power of ideas. Now, to paraphrase the late US Senator Sam Ervin, I'm just an economist. But over the years, we economists have figured out a thing or two about the value of ideas. Beginning in the 1990s, economists developed a framework for articulating the economic value of ideas. Paul Romer was at the forefront of this and was awarded the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his contribution. This area of economics has become known as endogenous growth theory. Rather than taking the rate of technical progress as being given, or exogenous, as the then standard neoclassical model did, Romer emphasised that the rate of technological process is determined by the generation of ideas and scientific knowledge. His key observation was that knowledge can be an important driver of long-run economic growth in a market economy. Before Romer, economists thought of economic growth as being determined solely by physical capital and labour. Romer expanded this to include knowledge and noted that the stock of knowledge is determined by research and development activities broadly conceived. This includes what universities refer to as both basic research and applied research. There are two things to note about ideas that are different from physical capital, like machines. First, they're non-rival. If one person is using Pythagoras' theorem, it doesn't prevent anyone else from using it. In other words, once discovered, there's no monopoly on finding the length of the hypotenuse of a triangle. This is very different from standard economic goods. If one person is eating a salad, it precludes other people from eating that salad. Second, some ideas can be made excludable in the sense that others can be prevented from using them through policies such as patents or technologies such as encryption. The production of ideas often involves large fixed costs, such as the initial research and development, and low marginal costs for subsequent production of each unit of the good or service. Economists like me refer to this as increasing returns to scale. Excludability, such as through patents, is important for allowing firms to recover their initial fixed costs. Otherwise, ideas may never be developed in the first place. Balancing non-rivalness and excludability has been a major focus of economists' work on economic growth. One important insight is that decentralised, market-based solutions will not always lead to the right balance of excludability and non-rivalness. This points to a role for different forms of knowledge production. Romer himself emphasised the importance of universities. Universities have long been, and continue to be, a major source of basic and applied research. This makes university research a fundamental driver of economic growth. In fact, endogenous growth theory is essential in explaining some of the basic empirical facts about economic growth. These facts only started to emerge in the mid-1980s with the rise of large cross-country data sets on growth over time. The old neoclassical growth model could not explain persistent differences between countries in the rate of economic growth. It also predicted that poorer countries would grow faster than richer countries because of decreasing returns to physical capital. This wasn't true in the data either. Endogenous growth theory provides a compelling explanation of the essential empirical facts about economic growth. Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Lucas once observed that once you start thinking about economic growth, it's difficult to think about anything else. Anyone who doubts that would do well to compare and contrast the relative fortunes of Japan and the United States over the last 3 decades. In 1995, Japan's GDP per capita, a pretty good measure of living standards, was $44,000 a person in 2022 US dollars. US GDP per capita was just under $29,000 in 1995. So Japan's living standards were 54% higher than those of the United States. Fast forward to 2022, and the US had grown to over $76,000 per capita. Japan, after a series of lost decades, had actually shrunk to $34,000 per capita, or 55% lower than the United States. The US had grown at 3.7% a year, while Japan had shrunk at 1% a year. So it's not an overstatement to say that generating and applying knowledge is the cornerstone of rising living standards. Countries that consistently do it better can provide their citizens with more public goods like healthcare and high-quality education, more opportunities for social mobility, and better lives. We are thankfully speaking more and more about productivity in Australia. Ideas, this is where productivity comes from. So how do we go about funding sovereign research capability in Australia? Well, start with this. We've become addicted to funding that research capability through international student income. In a time of global uncertainty and upheaval, this is a huge strategic risk. It places a ticking time bomb beneath Australia's security and prosperity. International student income pays for much of our research infrastructure. It pays for buildings, electricity, scientific equipment, and a range of other overheads necessary to undertake scientific research that is partly funded by government. Commonwealth grants provide an overhead rate of less than 20%. By contrast, in the cradle of innovation, the United States, pre-Trump 47, which is something I'll come back to later, universities typically get the true cost of around 55%. So every time an Australian university gets a grant, it has to find another 35% just to keep the lab's lights on. Actually, it's worse than that. Our universities need to demonstrate skin in the game to win those grants. This involves everything from salary support for young scholars to comply with enterprise bargaining agreements to matching money for the grant. In the flagship ARC Centres of Excellence program, which has been behind Australia's much-lauded quantum capability and its numerous high-tech spin-outs, universities need to match government funding dollar for dollar. The fields that are most expensive require universities to stump up the most money. What are those fields, you may well ask? Well, just look at the AUKUS Pillar 2 list. Right now, the Department of Education funds overheads from a common pool, one which hasn't been growing in real terms, not just for the research grants it manages, but for an ever-increasing list of research funding from philanthropy, business, state governments and other agencies. As more things get added to the pool, the overhead rate drops for everything, including the Commonwealth's grants. This is the very definition of a broken system. A better approach would be for each funder to cover the overheads associated with their own research program. Education would be responsible for the ARC and the other programs it administers. If other agencies like Defence want to increase their research, they'd also need to find money for overheads rather than drawing on the common pool. State governments, business, philanthropy and the Medical Research Future Fund would have responsibility to fund their own research agendas and not rely on the Commonwealth to fund their overheads. This would cost $1.2 billion a year. The hard truth is that we've had 15 years of bipartisan disinvestment in research expenditure. Relative to GDP, Australia's R&D spending was a third higher when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister than in 2023. Over these 15 years, business expenditure is down and government expenditure is down. Only university expenditure on R&D has risen, and that increase has been almost entirely funded by foreign student fees. Sovereign research capability is built over decades, but it can be lost in months. We must stop dithering. Now, I can stand here with a straight face and say that $1.2 billion a year in the context of a $700 billion federal budget and a nearly $3 trillion Australian economy is, to be blunt, rounding error. But I'm also conscious that sounds an awful lot like I'm talking my own book. And I'm acutely aware that some of my friends in the university sector have stood at this very podium, told stories about what's good about research, and asked for a blank cheque. That's okay, that's their job, but I'm here to do something different. I want to emphasise that yes, that $1.2 billion will earn a very high social and economic return for Australia. And in a tumultuous global landscape where we can no longer rely on our most important ally the way we have in the past, we must secure our sovereign research capability. It is essential for our economic and our national security. But funding research the right way will also align the incentives of the sector much more closely with the goals of government and the desires of the Australian people. As anyone in corporate life knows, cross-subsidies are poison. Cross-subsidies muddy the price signals that best guide resource allocation decisions, they produce a lack of transparency, and they create significant incentive problems. In this instance, what is true in corporate life is also true in university life. And right now, we use international student revenues to cross-subsidise research. That doesn't mean that international students aren't incredibly valuable for Australia and Australian universities? They are. They help fund better instructors and more resources for teaching domestic undergraduate students in an increasingly competitive and globalised tertiary education landscape. They allow Australian undergraduates to get what is often a genuinely world-class education for 1/5 of what it costs at comparable universities in the United States. They provide significant financial benefits across the economy, far beyond our university campuses. But when we have a huge misalignment between the source of revenues and the use of revenues, well, we're just asking for trouble. And trouble is what we've seen. Funding research properly is not so much about more money, it's about the right money. By better aligning the incentives of universities and the desires of the public, we can turn what has too often been zero-sum conflict into a mutually beneficial joint enterprise for the benefit of the nation. The Trump challenge. Prime Minister Jim Hacker once said, "May I remind the Secretary of State for Defence that every problem is also an opportunity," to which Sir Humphrey replied, "I think the Secretary of State for Defence fears that this may create some insoluble opportunities." What President Trump is doing to research funding in the US is a little bit like that. Some of the world's great universities are under direct attack. Harvard, the oldest university in the United States and the most important in the world, just had $2.2 billion in funding. Actually, update since 24 hours ago, $2.7 billion in funding, stripped for having the temerity to resist the Trump administration's push to intervene in their choice of faculty, students and their curriculum. Now they've been banned from enrolling international students, including Australians. The overheads on NIH grants have been slashed, and the government is simply refusing to reimburse expenditures on existing grants from the National Science Foundation and other sources. I just came back from a week at MIT and Harvard, and I heard directly the concerns of faculty members that they have about what will happen to students, researchers, and the path-breaking research that they undertake. Australia is not immune from the carnage in the US higher education sector. The Australian Academy of Science estimates that more than $300 million of funding for research by Australian university researchers is already in jeopardy. This has serious implications not only for the research involved, but for Australian researchers, especially those at earlier stages of their careers. It will damage, perhaps shatter, long-standing and valuable collaborations between Australian and US researchers. We will need to plug this gap. This is the problem part of the equation, but there's also an opportunity part. With the US stepping back from its leadership role, Australia has a chance to step up. In coming months and years, many leading US researchers may be looking to move their labs, their families, and their lives abroad. If we act decisively, Australia can be as or more attractive a destination for those researchers as Europe, which, if we're being honest, and there's no reason not to be, has its own issues. What's happening to US research and researchers is shocking, but this act of American self-harm is our opportunity, and it's an opportunity that has never arisen before and may never arise again. In justifying his acceptance of a $400 million aircraft from Qatar, President Trump invoked the words of legendary golfer Sam Snead. "When your opponent gives you a putt, just say thank you and walk to the next tee." Now, it turns out Sam Snead never actually said that, but that's not important right now. In destroying the US research ecosystem, President Trump is giving us a putt, a freebie. We should just say thank you and walk to the next tee, along with some of the world's finest researchers. A future made in Australia. The Albanese government speaks of a future made in Australia. The Prime Minister seems to have in mind the manufacture of physical goods. I've made no secret of my scepticism about our ability to turn the clock back to the 1960s. We have a better chance when it comes to advanced manufacturing, as I wrote in my 2022 book, From Free to Fair Markets, with Rosalind Dixon. Germany has a long and proud tradition in this area, but other leading countries in high-tech, high-wage, advanced manufacturing of precision goods include France, Italy and the Netherlands. Surely we can compete with those countries. But let's not forget that ideas are things too. They need to be produced as well. And as I emphasised earlier, ideas are a crucial driver of economic growth and living standards. A future made in Australia can and should be one where we manufacture ideas, not just physical goods. We live in a rapidly changing world. A world whose technological possibilities, economies, and social interactions will be shaped by the ideas that we create and implement. Evolutionary biologists have a concept called punctuated equilibria, where evolutionary progress can proceed in a great leap rather than gradually. And legal scholar Bruce Ackerman has spoken of constitutional moments, where there can be great change to constitutional arrangements in a short period of time. We are living through a technological moment. We don't know what this moment will bring. We don't know what challenges will arise or opportunities will unfold. We don't know what it will mean for Australia and our place in the world. This might seem daunting, even scarier, but we should remember and be comforted by the words of Robert F. Kennedy in 1966. Our future may lie beyond our vision, but it is not completely beyond our control. We have a choice. We can embrace this technological moment or miss it. We can meet this moment or miss it. We can secure our research sovereignty or surrender it. I hope we'll do the former. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian and Richard. Just before we ask questions, I'd just like a little break and intermission to say the Australian Electoral Council has just confirmed that David Pocock and Katie Gallagher have been elected ACT senators, so congratulations. Now, Brian, you made the point that you've had 16 ministers in the time that you've been in Australia, and I understand currently research is scattered across 14 different federal departments. So that's a lot of gaps that things can fall between. Now, I know Ed has commissioned a review by Ian Chubb, who's in the audience today. How do we move on from another report? I'm not saying it's just another report, but it is another report. And the government, what is the government going to do with that when we have seen a reluctance to actually build research revenues as a part of GDP? Yeah, sorry.
So I think that the report is necessary to design this complex ecosystem I've talked about, that I think really was achieved in 2001. So I think the hooks are there to at least design the ecosystem. But then, of course, we need to operationalize the ecosystem and not just do little bits and pieces of it, and then commission a new report a year and a half later and redesign it again. Because what I've just talked about, that's the way it's actually worked. We haven't maybe spent the effort to design the big ecosystem bits, and we tend to chop and change all the time. So we are at a place where I think we can design the system, and that will be coming out in the next 6 to 9 months. And hopefully encouraging the designers, several of who are in this room, to think big and think holistically. And then we actually need to do it. And then we need to take a deep breath for 5 years and say it's a 5-year program. And then we're going to look at it after 5 years and, as I said, fix the things that aren't working, keep the things that are, and provide some continuity.
I hate to be cynical, but I've been writing about this sector for over 20 years. And I think the only major advance was, Kim Carr increasing the amount of money for indirect costs. I mean, can we have confidence that there is going to be any, rethinking of the ecosystem, given how diverse that ecosystem is?
We can do it. Other countries are doing it. We're particularly bad at it, if I can be honest. I mean, the US, for all its craziness, has a pretty stable ecosystem that you kind of know what you're buying into until, of course, the last 6 to 8 weeks. That's why it's a big shock. But Europe does this, the UK does this. we are particularly bad at it. We're not prepared to back in research. And it has to be bipartisan because, you know, we have electoral change. It has to be something where people say, this is something that matters for Australia. Because I'm telling you, China is doing exactly what I would tell them to do. They're following the book, and you can say, well, is that a bad thing? No, it's the smart thing for them to do. They're doing it, and we're going to either be left behind or we're going to pedal hard and go along side by side with them, and it's our choice. It's our destiny.
Okay.
So I think if people understand what's on the cards, I am hoping that they're prepared to change what we're doing and not expect some miracle to occur doing the same thing over and over again.
Okay, we have a lot of journalists here today. Just one question to you, Richard. So you talked about, you know, this opportunity out of the chaos in the US to bring in researchers and research teams. That's very expensive. We're watching a lot of universities going through massive cost-cutting measures at the moment. Who pays for it? Governments, universities? Where does the money come from?
Well, you're right, it is expensive, and these researchers are more expensive than what Australian universities are sometimes used to. I know a number of universities around the country who understand the opportunity here and are prioritising it and are making resources available to be able to do it. And the Australian Academy of Science has a fundraising initiative going at the moment, and anyone who's interested should go to their website and look at it to try and raise external money to be able to support this. And they're taking a institutionally agnostic approach to doing that. It's for the benefit of the country, not just for any particular institution. But you're right, it won't be cheap, and that's why we need to see this for what it is. It's a once in a, you know, multi-generation moment, and it won't be around for much longer.
And it's going to take a GoFundMe page. Okay, our first question is Simon Gross from Canberra IQ.
I've got questions for both of you from your speeches. Brian, you talked about ANU changing its approach to royalties. And could you outline what changes you did and what kind of outcomes you can show from that? And Richard, you compared Japan and the US over a period of time in terms of GDP per capita. What proportion of that change would have been due to the computing and social media eruption in the US? And to what extent is that due to knowledge and or aggressive entrepreneurialism?
All right, so at the ANU, I mean, I kind of highlighted, we focused not on locking down revenue streams that might exist at the expense of killing deals. We tried to break the friction so that, for example, Dan Shattuck, who's here in the audience, could, without any issue, go out and start a company knowing I'm going to give him more or less N years, where N is a large number, to come back. If the company falls over, he's going to get to keep his professorship. So trying to limit the barriers to doing it. We started a venture capital fund, ANU Connect Ventures, this was done before me, that could go through and fund good ideas. It ended up making, it's been closed out, it made over 15% per annum over 15 years, which, you know, I wouldn't mind having a piece of that myself. So it's looking at all the barriers and trying to get rid of them. But the biggest one is saying we want to lower the friction for our ideas and the people with them to go out and do it. And so that's what we systematically did. And what was it, literally 10 times more firms leaving the university. That was the change.
You raised two things in comparing and contrasting the US and Japan. I think you're right about both of them. You know, the first was the role of the sort of technology revolution in its various forms. Over the time frame I talked about, we were still seeing, if you like, the implementation of the personal computer revolution all throughout the US and other economies as well. And then, of course, there was the internet revolution and the real growth of Silicon Valley. And that goes to your second point about this culture of, I think you called it aggressive entrepreneurialism. If not, it's a good one. I might steal that at some point. And that is really striking in the US. And, you know, that contrasts very sharply with what was going on in Japan with an aging population at the time. So these things aren't easy to do. You know, a minister doesn't just stand up and say, aggressive entrepreneurship, away we go.
No, it's a cultural thing.
It is part of this entire ecosystem, and it comes from the kind of funding arrangements and flexibility and taking away frictions and barriers that Brian just spoke about. It comes from the venture capital side of things in terms of funding arrangements and making sure our tax system aligns with that. It's a multifaceted thing. But that's the contrast. Japan was 50% wealthier and became 50% less wealthy than the United States in 3 decades. And that's what the difference looks like.
Okay, our next question is Katrina Jackson from Pearls and Irritations.
Gentlemen, g'day. Katrina Jackson, Pearls and Irritations. Thank you to both of you for the speech today, but also to both of you for speeches over years and years and years and the persistence you've both shown in driving this argument home between research and productivity. I'm not going to give you a free kick, but I want to ask you about the Armageddon that's going on in the US, not so you can reflect on how much better it is to be almost anywhere else than the US as an academic right now. Robert Wright calls it the attack on the American mind, what's going on with Harvard and Columbia. But I want to ask you what lessons we should draw on it in Australia, both universities and parliamentarians, because what's happening there is terrible and extreme, but we're not entirely innocent here, are we?
All right, well, that's, where do I start? So part of it is researchers like us need to make sure we have a conversation with normal people around the country and have a conversation so that they're part of it. Make sure that their kids have an opportunity, if they're so inclined, to come and study at university and become an astronomer. It's not seen as sort of the, this unattainable thing at a university. It's not what they see. So I think having that conversation with the public is important. But there's something much more fundamental going on right now, which is just how the country is governed, okay? So it is important that Australia continue to interrogate its democracy. So this is not the STEM side. This is the humanities and social sciences. What democracy do we want? Are we proud that we have an independent electoral commission? Are we proud that we have a preferential voting system? I think we are, but we need to keep having that conversation. And then I'm going to let Richard think a little bit about distribution. You know, one of the things that Richard said, well, all this GDP per capita is accrued in the United States, but it accrued very unevenly. And so the US became richer with this hyper entrepreneurialism, but a lot of people ended up being left behind. So there's also a balance, I think, between growth and distribution that is more of the economist bit that I think the US has gotten terribly wrong, and which I am very happy on the world stage how Australia does. It's not perfect, but I think we get the balance between incentives and taking care of people better than most countries.
Well, when Brian gives me homework, I try and do a good job, so let me see what I can do. And I'm conscious that we've got Andrew Lee, one of the world's leading experts on inequality here, and he and I just had a conversation last Friday at the Sydney Writers' Festival about inequality. Australia has done a lot better, and we should be really proud of that. Inequality in Australia, we can talk about the level, but it hasn't gotten worse in the last 20 years in Australia, income inequality in Australia. There are lots of intergenerational equity issues about housing and various other things that we're finally starting to have a really serious conversation about, and I don't want to underplay the importance of those things, but we have done a lot better in Australia. I think that what happened in the US was that the average real wage didn't grow for 50 years. Australia's experience is fundamentally different from that. We've done a lot better at having, widespread, broad, what some people might call inclusive growth. And I think that's partially a consequence of the kind of democratic institutions of which Brian spoke. I think we also do a better job at having what Rosalind Dixon and I spoke about in the book that I mentioned, a generous social minimum, a social safety net that focuses on poverty. And I think that that's an important part, not just thinking about income inequality, but thinking about taking care of the least advantaged members of our society, and whether that's through Medicare or whether that's through public schooling or a variety of other things. I think Australia does a much better job at that. We've got to keep our eye on the ball of that. And that need not come at the expense of being able to incentivise innovation. As long as there isn't a kind of prosperity-killing politics of envy, and you can think about how that might manifest itself in any range of economic policies. As long as we steer clear of that, and so far we have for the last several decades, then I think we're in a good shape to keep Australia what it is socially, but become more innovative and generate the kind of prosperity that we've just been talking about.
Thank you. Our next question, Kat Wong from AAP.
Thank you both for your addresses today. So in the last 10 years, we've seen a real rise in anti-intellectualism, particularly in the US, and I believe that's been pretty supercharged in the last 5 years. Do you think that this is something that has reached Australian shores, and in what ways do you think it's contributed to this, grim state of the university sector that you've kind of painted today?
Okay, so anti-intellectualism has existed forever. It's how it's able to be amplified. And I think there is different ways that amplification occurs, notably between the US and Australia. We have an e-safety commissioner who is, as near as I can tell, the bête noire of the US tech community. And so there are some profound differences of amplification. But there's, as we just talked about, some profound differences of the actual what is going on the ground. So from my perspective, if people share in the prosperity and they know that they're not shut out of the prosperity just because of where they were born or what happens to them in life, then we're in great shape to, I would say, have this inclusive growth model continue on. I think the US is a cautionary tale of things you might want to not do in this country that will potentially cause Australia to become a country that is a much less happy place than it is now. This is a great country to live in. It's genuinely a great country. It's not perfect. We want to make it better. But I do think we're in a surprisingly good spot right now relative to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I'm pretty encouraged by Australia. I mean, Brian's achievements, are widely celebrated. He's a well-known person in Australia. My colleague, Michelle Simmons, was Australian of the Year. I haven't sort of checked the tape, but my guess would there has been more researchers who've been Australian of the Year than sports people who've been Australian of the Year. I'm quite encouraged by how we think about those sorts of things in Australia.
Oh, thank you. Okay, our next question is from James Riley, Innovation Oz.
Thanks very much for your contribution today. Can I ask, does it surprise you that you're giving presentations today on the importance of sovereign research capability, that we've just had a federal election campaign where these kinds of issues, science generally, innovation generally, any kind of structural issues around industry really didn't figure? So I guess I'm asking, given a lot of the people in this room, those structural issues are quite well understood. But when you look at the federal parliament now, when you look at the senior ranks of this government, who do you see as the thinkers in this area and people who are going to push it, push this message as you would like it pushed?
Oh, Richard, I think I'm going to give you this one first.
Great. I've got the opportunity to offend, what is it, like 250 people, minus the handful I mentioned. Look, I think there are a lot of very good thinkers in the Australian Parliament and in the public service beyond that who clearly care a lot about Australia and do very good things. I'll be incredibly narrow and mention my three favourite economists in Parliament, Andrew Leigh, Andrew Charlton and Danny Molino, who've all got PhDs in economics and are at least as well placed as I am to speak about these issues, but from the inside. But there are clearly a lot of Australian politicians and public servants who understand these issues very well, who care about them and communicate them very well. So I feel good about that.
And I'm just going to say that the challenge we have is elections are in 3-year cycles, and these issues are multi-generational. And I'm at least glad that we didn't poo-poo these issues during the election. But they're very hard to get differences between parties, and I don't want differences between parties because we need continuity. The one thing between the Republicans and the Democrats until just recently is they always backed the National Science Foundation. Why? Because it was for the United States. I want that. I don't want to have different policies on the ARC, the NHMRC, et cetera, et cetera. That's bad for the country. We need people to put the hard work in. Yeah, we're here because we've had an election, and it's a good time to talk about things because people got 3 years to do good things. That's why we're here now, rather than in the middle of the election cycle.
Okay. Lily Nothling from the ABC.
Hello, my question's for Brian and slightly different topic. The Nixon Review was released yesterday and paints a pretty damning picture of bullying, harassment, sexism, racism and nepotism at ANU's Medical College. It said that these issues have been going on unchecked for many years. As the former Vice-Chancellor, what's your reaction to the report and how much responsibility do you take for failing to stamp these issues out?
Yeah, so not an unexpected question. I think it's an important thing to address. So the review clearly shines lights on problems at the ANU while I was Vice-Chancellor. And I'll be honest, it didn't make easy reading for me. And so I do congratulate the current Vice-Chancellor for taking action, as well as the people who have contributed to the review. In the end, a review like this is taken so that the university can be better. Now, I'll explicitly answer so that I'm hoping I kind of say everything that I can say. Why didn't I act on these matters is what our people asked. And what I can say is in my 8 years as Vice-Chancellor at ANU, I did act on every single issue I was aware of, and I regularly went across campus looking for such problems and tried to create easier ways for them to be reported. And I indeed did act and was aware of issues across the university, including in this part of the university. That being said, we went through and made some comprehensive changes, the way we act on sexual violence, on harassment, gender diversity, racism, and Indigenous inclusion, and those were things that we did over those 8 years. The hard reality is with 20,000 students and 4,000 staff members, you do not get everything right all the time. And I can honestly say that I personally took no shortcuts, and I did absolutely everything within my ability, but I still acknowledge that people missed out and had bad things done to them. And I have to take responsibility for that because it's under my watch. And so I do apologize to anyone who's affected, and I mean that. The people who were affected deserve better, but I, more than anything, look forward to the university acting on the report. And I think it's a really important thing that institutions, universities go through, always try to be better and really look and be prepared to shine light on the problems, not run away from them. And I think that's what ANU has done at this time.
Thank you. Our next question is Neve Walton from the Canberra Times.
Thank you. Considering what you've said about the Nixon report today and our discussion about looking broader to attract more attention while there's a gap in the international market, how do we do both? Look towards to attract international researchers while also making sure that we don't leave behind the students and staff at our own institutions.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
So I think something that's underappreciated is the great complementarities between university research and university teaching. And I sometimes hear people say, well, you've got people in universities who do great research and then you've got the people who sort of teach undergraduates. That's not been my experience. That's not been my experience as a graduate student at Harvard or a faculty member at MIT or the University of Chicago. And it sure hasn't been my experience as a faculty member at UNSW for the last 14 or so years. It's not always true, but my experience has been that on the whole, the best researchers also make for the best teachers. And I think we sometimes forget the kind of experiences that our domestic undergraduates and beyond that, our students at our universities have from being taught by some of the leading minds in the country and the world. And we could do a better job of communicating that as a sector, but I think we've got a really good story to tell about that. So if we can bring some of the world's great minds to Australia, I think that'll be good for our research, it'll be good for our productivity, but it'll be really good for our students as well.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is Ewa Strazewska from SBS. Sorry, Ewa.
It's Eva Staszewska from SBS. Sorry, Julie. So education research is a major part of Australia's relations with China, bilateral relations. However, the US is one of, obviously, our key allies. What challenges does being wedged between these two relations have on Australian universities and the sector more broadly?
So the biggest worry, in my opinion, is overreaction and not thinking through how we work sensibly together. They're our biggest two-way trading partner, and the US is an ally that we do, obviously, a huge amount of research with. So I'll remind people that most of the research we do is by definition in the public. We talked about it, it's shared. And so if I work on, for example, understanding the most distant quasar in the universe with someone in Shanghai, am I causing harm? And the answer is, I don't think so at all. We're sharing knowledge, we're raising all boats, and we're hopefully breaking down some of the barriers that might cause us to get into an unnecessary skirmish or fight downstream. So 95% of what universities do is more or less, like I've just said, trying to understand the most distant quasar in the universe. There are things where clearly our interests are not well aligned, and it's really important that we know those things and don't think it goes both ways. They have problems on their side, we have problems on our side, and we're learning to step away and say those are areas where we're just not going to work on things together. That technology can be used to track submarines, for example. Just not going to do it. And we have developed, through something called the University Foreign Interference Task Force, which I used to be on, but I'm no longer on, quite a comprehensive way to look at risk and to understand it. But I think overreacting and saying, we're not going to do anything with anyone, well, that's how to ensure we really do get into a conflict downstream, and we end up with multiple systems and everyone being worse off and potentially way worse off. So I think it is certainly right now manageable, but we need to be conscious of the risks. Clearly, if status changed and you have to decouple more, well, that will be a very, very sad day for Australian people, but we will do it if we need to.
Okay, next question. Next question, Nick Stewart, Ability News.
President Trump has talked about the need for countries to boost defence spending. Obviously, Australia is spending less on defence itself than Trump would like. You've both reinforced the importance of AUKUS Pillar 2, which is broader spending on research rather than specific spending on welders and soldiers with rifles. Do you think that this is a way forward for Australia, that it needs to, as you said, Brian, actually carve out money from the federal budget that is being used for research spending, and this would be a way of appeasing the US demands for increased defence spending? And finally, can I also ask, you're both graduates of Harvard, how can we trust what you say?
All right. I'm going to give it a quick stab and then go. So it is very difficult for me to actually parse what Trump means when he says something. Okay? I think anyone who says they understand it is either a fool or a liar. So let's just make that clear. So does it make sense for Australia to shore up their sovereign capability in a whole bunch of technologies that have dual use, and you can imagine creating lots of great companies that help make better toasters for Australians at the same time of making drones that can help keep us secure. That makes a lot of sense. But we need to really integrate much more than we do now, the research done. And, we have Tanya here from DSTG, and I know she has been on both systems. So we have an opportunity to do more in this space and bring these things together. And that's a big change of culture. And I think it's a great opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. But we do really need to design it together. Harvard, I don't know. Maybe, what are your reflections of Harvard right now?
So when I was there a couple of weeks ago, it still felt like the same place that we both remember from there. I spoke to a lot of my friends and former mentors and so on, but they were really scared, and they weren't scared for themselves. They were scared for the institution and for their students and for what it was going to do to knowledge production and what that university's done. And the people at institutions across America are scared. So it's not broken yet, but it might not take much more to really do permanent damage, and that's what I think they're worried about, and it's what concerns people like me and Brian, I think, too.
Yeah, and it's a melting pot that Australia gets huge value out of. As I said, I met my wife here, who's doing an economics degree, same department as Richard, and so it brought us together, and, it's not the only reason I'm in Australia, but it's a good reason why I am, and, you got... I think reasonable value out of me coming here. Some people may disagree, but if that suddenly goes away, don't think something's suddenly going to replace it. It's going to be essentially a Vegemite job with everything smeared all over the world, and all of us will be worse off.
I get the sense that Trump will last 4 years and Harvard will endure for centuries, but maybe I'm just being an optimist.
You could do more damage than you think in 4 years. Do not underestimate what is possible.
Okay, before we thank our two guests, I'd like to present them both with a gold pass to the National Press Club. We hope to see you here soon, and thank you both very much.